Okay, I'm just going to summarize this part just for completion. This is more of a philosophical thought process of how the possibilities came about in the past. The author goes through this several examples of how the big minds, big governments, secret government, advisory committees, and various real-life incidences from the past drove the thought process of end of the world and how they could be tackled. It's more of a I'm not so interested in these parts because it doesn't directly relate to governing the geoengineering as a global community, which comes in the next section. So this is the last part of the book called Possibilities, and this particular section is called The Ends of the World. It is interesting to read, but I will just summarize it for the completion of the course. Here is another piece from the Flowbot's handlebars from 2005. I can guide a missile by satellite, by satellite, by satellite, and I can hit a target through a telescope, through a telescope, through a telescope, and I can end the planet in a holocaust, in a holocaust, in a holocaust, in a holocaust, in a holocaust. I can ride my bike with no handlebars. We all done that, right? So you can figure out what the relevance is. The book again goes back to the idea we discussed before with Saudi and the potential for energy from nuclear power to do many things, including controlling the climate. And the discussion here also goes a little bit into how it is now again being considered in the context of asteroids that could crash into Earth, and how there is a whole section of NASA which looks at solutions for these, and the original ideas were to blow up the asteroids, but that made it possible for it to break into pieces and then maybe may do more damage than to avoid the collision completely. So the ideas have now evolved into maybe having a nuclear blast nearby the asteroid on its way towards Earth and just deflect its path away from Earth, which is quite possible theoretically. And then the concept is that if an asteroid can be steered away from the planet, then maybe an enemy can also plan to steer it towards Earth and do some damage. So these are the kind of ends of the world scenarios, but there are some historic precedences. For example, John von Neumann, who was at Princeton along with Einstein, wrote in 1955 in the Fortune magazine, Can We Survive Technology? And some of the wordings do correspond to this end of the world, but also controlling climate. Okay, so a piece of it of the article here, rather fantastic effects. Furthermore, it's known that the persistence of large ice fields is due to the fact that ice both reflects sunlight energy and radiates away terrestrial energy at a higher rate than ordinary soil. Microscopic layers of colored matter spread on an icy surface or in the atmosphere above 1 could inhibit the reflection radiation processes, melt the ice, and change the local climate. So we are talking about direct climate science here. Measures that would affect such changes are technically possible. So we are talking about modifying weather now. And the amount of investment required would be only of the order of magnitude that suffice to develop rail systems and other major industries. So this is sounding like a plan to say how would we get funding for it. The main difficulty lies in predicting in detail the effects of any such drastic interventions, but our knowledge of the dynamics and controlling processes in the atmosphere is rapidly approaching a level that would permit such predictions. So he's talking about the emerging field of weather prediction at the time with Jules Charney and so on in the 1950s to do already climate control. Probably interventions in atmospheric and climatic matters will come in a few decades and will unfold on a scale difficult to imagine at present. So this is the same time where Einstein was thinking of a world which is nuclear free, whereas von Neumann and Edward Teller was around, who went on to do many big thinking ideas for the military, for the government, and so on. So there is a history of the evolution of the nuclear power and the awesome power it brought over Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and then the ideas that evolved on how it could be used in warfares, and of course also how it could be used to control various global scale things, including what some called as geophysical wars. Okay, the idea also evolved around the so-called nuclear winter with people like Carl Sagan, who was a charismatic person. Paul Crutzen was already writing reports on how a nuclear blast wouldn't do as much direct damage as it would in terms of the shock waves, the dust, and the fire, and other things. So it was not a matter of just emissions from the nuclear blast, but its damage across the globe, depending on how large it is. And the idea of nuclear power and how many nuclear bombs would be needed to solve problems like California's drought by blowing up snow on the mountain, or flooding the Sahara by blowing up ice in the Arctic, and so on, have been discussed in various ideas. But the concept of nuclear winter has persisted, and of course there have been debates about whether the Sagan paper from the 1980s overestimated the impact. So the terminology went from nuclear winter to nuclear fall, etc. But big ideas have been around, and the author consistently uses the phrase Promethean science. I think those who are familiar with the Greek mythology know that Prometheus was the one who took fire from Olympus and gave it to humans, and he was punished for that by Zeus by tying him with a chain to a boulder, and I think a falcon or vulture was attacking him every day to eat his liver, which would grow back, and eventually he was saved by Hercules, and so on. But the idea is that Promethean science is rebellious, innovative science, which is big and beyond what is ordinarily done under the framework of societal science, and so on. So the terminology has now transferred from those kind of catastrophes to calling the climate itself as not anymore just climate change, but calling it climate crisis, climate catastrophe, and so on. And there is lots of social scientists who argue that this is not a good idea, and I happen to agree with it as well. Simply naming more and more, giving more and more alarmist names to these things are probably counterproductive. But images like this, the flooding of New Orleans during Katrina in 2005, I think, and this is the idea of what climate catastrophe would look like. There are many such images: planet on fire, planet dripping with excess rain and floods, is actually leading to rising eco-anxiety. Means we should address mental health alongside food security. This is a nice article from The Conversation. So climate anxiety is a real thing now. So if you think about telling children all the time that climate is going to destroy the planet, then you are probably not giving them much hope for the future. I would rather have children still imagine building rockets to go to Mars, Moon, and beyond, and think of solving the climate problem rather than thinking the world is coming to an end. Putting up signs everywhere saying don't do this, don't do that, don't travel, don't eat meat, don't consume anything is probably going to have its limitations. So the idea of nuclear winter and the catastrophes, end of the world, also emerged out of the Alvarez brothers' discovery of iridium, which was a indication of asteroid crash, and iridium coming from outside because it's not that abundant in Earth's crust in the Italian mountains, which was then linked to the time of dinosaur extinction, and there is still debate about whether it's the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, or the aftermath, or the diseases that emerged afterwards, and so on and so forth. But you get such fantastic images, timeline of the dinosaur killing asteroid. So 5 seconds before impact, the asteroid blasts a hole in the Earth's atmosphere, causing a global supersonic shock wave. So if it is large enough, that's exactly what you would expect. Asteroid smashes into the Earth with an explosion that's 1 billion times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. So there is the terminology of always going towards comparing with how many nuclear bombs it takes to do various things. 1 minute after, creatures are incinerated as molten lava enters the atmosphere at 100,000 miles an hour. 100,000 miles an hour, with some hitting the moon. You can imagine how far that 300,000 miles. 5 minutes after, molten rocks high in the air turn into small glass bullets as they cool and fall, killing any remaining flying dinosaurs. So you can see the various artistic impressions, and then slowly ocean would have gotten suffocated, and ocean ecosystem would have been wiped out. Anything bigger than a crocodile would have died according to some estimates. So this is what led to the nuclear winter kind of arguments, which still goes on. And obviously many in the government wouldn't be distracted by such depictions of nuclear winter or nuclear fall and so on. So coming back to geoengineering and the planetary scale experiments, or experiments with unintended consequences, end of the world scenarios are mentioned by people who are very set against geoengineering as a bad thing. But these are the people who also like alarmist messages about climate crisis, climate catastrophe, and it's critical to think about whether climate action will come from such eco-anxiety point of view, or if it will come from what is called parasympathetic nervous system, or rest and digest point of view, where we learn to be more optimistic about the future, have a vision for the future about what happens if we find solutions, and not keep thinking that we are always hitting the guardrail and preventing ourselves from going off the cliff by controlling emissions and doing government action. People believe that if only governments could act, we could solve the climate problem. But as we started in the beginning, is it really that simple? So that's the question for all these end of the world talks and contradictory assumptions about how climate solutions can be found, and how geoengineering is bad. So that dichotomy has to be solved somehow. And the end of the world's idea is also to see if some rogue nation, some military, will go ahead and try to do something on its own, and what legal framework is needed to define some of these things, which have happened in the 1970s, when it was found that many militaries were doing a kind of geoengineering experiments like cloud seeding during wars, or defoliation in the Indo-Pacific region of Asia during the war as well, to bring out the enemy and not provide and take away places to hide and so on. So humanity does think big, and there is always a section that worries about big thinkers, but geoengineering is one of those which is headed towards this big thinking, and what is done secretly, and what will be done secretly, and what will be done with open scientific discussion and so on, are good global governance questions.